Un discurso político que remueve los mercados es señal de poder. Una pandemia mundial es señal de lo frágiles que somos. El destacado manejo de la crisis en Alemania es señal de un buen liderazgo. El cambio climático y la sequía son señal de que tenemos mucho por hacer. La colaboración entre pequeñas empresas es señal de un país que está cambiando. Las señales hay que leerlas. Sigue la dirección correcta del mundo y tus negocios. DF Full Digital, contenidos especializados y más. Diario Financiero. Las señales hay que leerlas. Un discurso político que remueve los...
Hola, muy buenos días. Soy Nicolás Shea, presidente del G100. Muy bienvenidos a todos. Contamos con 3 oradores extraordinarios hoy día. Parto por presentar a nuestra anfitriona, Lüders, periodista y directora del Diario Financiero, a nuestro ministro de Hacienda, el señor Ignacio Briones, economista, doctor en Economía Política del Instituto de Estudios Políticos de París. Y por último, tenemos el honor de contar con nosotros con Rolnik. Guy es periodista, profesor de estrategia y libre competencia de la Escuela de Negocios Booth de la Universidad de Chicago, es fundador de la organización de medios israelí The Marker y editor adjunto del diario Haaretz. El foco del profesor Rolnik ha estado en promover mercados abiertos y competitivos provistos de una sólida red de seguridad social. Cabe agregar que Marilí y Guy son posiblemente los economistas más influyentes de Chile e Israel respectivamente. Antes de empezar, permítanme contarles brevemente del G100 o Grupo de los 100 para justificar además mi presencia entre tan extraordinario talento. El G100 nació en 2018 con el objetivo de liberar el espíritu emprendedor de todos los chilenos y construir así el Chile que soñamos y creemos merecer. Un país donde nuestro origen no determine nuestro destino y la felicidad dependa del esfuerzo, el riesgo y el talento de los chilenos, y en el que todos tengamos una verdadera oportunidad para alcanzarla. Así, este grupo de casi 100 emprendedores se unió con la misión de llevar lo que llamamos las 4 C, el consejo, contactos, capital y cariño a todos los emprendedores de Chile que así lo requieran, a través de la organización del Campeonato Nacional de Emprendimiento Nada nos detiene, que este año inicia su 2ª versión. Sabemos que en los tiempos que se vienen, nuestro espíritu emprendedor será lo que nos sacará adelante. Pero también sabemos que para que eso no basta solo el riesgo, el mérito y el esfuerzo, sino que necesitamos como condiciones previas un entorno de competencia justa. Es así como nuestras múltiples conversaciones dentro del G100 para encontrar las mejores soluciones probadas en otros países además, nos encontramos con una experiencia alucinante impulsada en Israel hace menos de una década, cuyo protagonista, Rolnik, viene a compartir con nuestro ministro de Hacienda y todos nosotros. Marilí, muchas gracias por acogernos en tu casa. Ministro, Guy, muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Muchas gracias, Nico, por esta introducción. Primero que nada, me gustaría también sumarme a tus palabras de agradecimiento a los invitados, pero también agradecerte a ti y al G100 por el trabajo que hacen para visibilizar y promover el emprendimiento en nuestro país. Sabemos que es un trabajo incansable y además difícil muchas veces, y te agradezco también la colaboración con el Diario Financiero en todos estos temas. Y solamente quiero hacer una breve acotación sobre nuestro invitado internacional. A mí me llena especialmente de orgullo poder presentar un líder que venga desde el periodismo. Rolnik fundó y dirigió con pasión un medio, The Marker, que logró mejorar la sociedad israelí, permitiendo instalar un debate sobre el concepto de competencia. Que su fuerza y creatividad sean una inspiración para nuestra propia labor periodística. Y gracias también al ministro Briones por sumarse con entusiasmo a este espacio de reflexión en medio de días sumamente desafiantes. Creemos que seguir en paralelo, volviendo a revisar los conceptos de cómo nos organizamos como sociedad y hablando de estos grandes temas, es hoy más necesario que nunca, a pesar de que el ruido nos haga parecer lo contrario. Les quiero contar que esta transmisión desde ahora en adelante va a pasar a ser en inglés, de manera de mantener la fluidez de la conversación con nuestro invitado internacional, pero paralelamente en el DF está la versión con traducción simultánea para todo lo que así lo quieran. Les quiero pedir que en cuanto a preguntas, comentarios, etcétera, por favor usen las redes sociales del Diario Financiero. Nicolás y yo estaremos revisándolo para sumar preguntas durante el panel. Así que pasemos ahora a una breve exposición de Rolnik en el marco de lo que Nicolás nos contó sobre su experiencia en Israel. Welcome, Guy, and please let's start with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And here are the slides. So thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor to present our work to the Chilean finance minister, Mr. Briones, and the subscribers and the readers and the leadership team of the the leading financial newspapers in Chile. So in Chile, we don't have time to, we can go to the next slide. So we don't have time to go back to the history of the Israeli economy. It's a very young state, as you know, it founded only in 1948 and has socialistic background. But like many other countries, he went through dramatic reforms that started in the 80s of privatizations, deregulation, and liberalization. And many of those reforms contributed immensely to the success of the economy, but they also brought new challenges. And 15 years ago, we started to see the rise of a few business groups that accumulated political power and market power. And in Israel, they were known as the tycoons or the families. So if you can please go to the next slide so we can continue. All right, okay. So here you can see an example actually. So we are talking now about 2009. At this point, the central bank governor of Israel is Professor Stanley Fischer, that was that later became the vice chair of the Federal Reserve of the US, and before that he was the vice chairman of the IMF. And this is a report that came out in 2009 by the Israeli Central Bank, looking at the fact that Israel is one of the most concentrated economies in the OECD. If my memory does not mistake me, I believe that Chile was also one of the companies at that point in time that were very close to the situation in Israel. So we had a few business groups that had a lot of sway and market share in the entire market. And we had two banks that controlled over 70% of the debt market in Israel. And many of those companies that had a lot of market share and had a large part of the economy were structured like pyramids. It means that you have at the top a holding company that has another holding company and another holding company. We got up until 7 layers of those pyramids. And those pyramids are very common not only in Israel and in many developing economies across the world. Next slide, please. So the biggest and the best example to see the pyramid structure and the sway that those companies had in the Israeli economy is the IDB group. It's not only because of its size, it was the biggest business group in Israel, but because it had 3 characteristics. Number one, the pyramid structures of 7 layers, enabling the control of huge capital with very little equity. So you have full control of a lot of money that you run for the public, yet the controlling shareholder had really little equity in the game. Now, number 2 is that the main cash cows that this group held were monopolies or companies that had significant market power in concentrated markets. And number three, they had controlled directly or indirectly the largest financial institutions in the country. You can see here on the slide a few examples. So the chairman of this holding company, this pyramid, the IDB, was one part of the family, and his cousin was the chairman of the largest bank. Together, they had anywhere between 20 to 30% of all financial assets in the country, with very, very little equity that they had in the game. They controlled the banks, they controlled an insurance company, they controlled the largest provider of the mobile company, Telcom, they controlled the monopoly of cement, and they controlled the largest retailer in the country, among 232 other companies that they had. Next slide, please. So what happens when you have a pyramid that controls a lot of businesses? So I won't go into the whole literature. Economists know that economists that are in corporate finance and in corporate governance, in political economy, know that these structures call for at least four problems. Number one is the agency's problem that you have. Number two is the tunneling, the huge incentive that people have to siphon assets from the bottom of the pyramid to the top of the pyramid while harming the minority shareholders. You had the multi-market context that is a problem for antitrust, is a problem for competition. And of course, you had the cross-holdings between financial and non-financial groups that I will elaborate on that soon. Next slide, please. Okay. So what is the political economy of concentration? So business groups have many ways to have influence on politicians and regulators. The literature acknowledges what we call the entrenchment problem, that you have a lot of incentives and levers of power to entrench your position in major markets. Sometimes they can also control national infrastructure, especially after we had a wave of privatization. And of course, which is key, and we might have some time to talk about it later, you also tend to have, when you have concentration in the business sector and the financial sector, you would also have a concentration in the news media landscape that really, again, gives you a sway with politicians and with the democratic process. So next slide, please. So here you can see a timeline of some of the reforms. All have to do with increasing competition, what we call in Chicago pro-market reforms, while reducing concentration. So our newspaper, The Marker, which is part of the Haaretz group and not affiliated with any of the business groups, promoted reforms to increase competition and decrease concentration for 25 years. And I will quickly go over three of the most important reforms. Next slide, please. So the first reform that, of course, faced significant pushback from the banks, a reform that I call the Israeli Glass-Steagall. So banks in Israel had to divest their asset management business in order to promote competition and reduce conflict of interest. Up until this reform, banks also controlled most of the asset management business in the country, the Provident Fund and the mutual funds, and they were also had a huge network of financial advisors. This is why you could not get an independent advice when it comes to securities and investment in the country. So with the banks in the capital market that have such market share in the capital market, it is clear that new players cannot emerge, not in the asset management business and sometimes not even in the real operating business, and a lot of conflicts on interest emerged. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the reform that I will concentrate in most of the discussion today, of course, and this is the anti-concentration committee. So the 2008 financial crisis was, of course, a huge threat, but also it can be an opportunity. So the business groups in the country that were leveraged demanded, of course, bailouts through tax money or through haircuts to the lenders, meaning the public pension. So we, at the market, we saw an opportunity to restructure the economy to be more competitive and more resilient. And the idea was to limit the numbers of layers in those pyramids, to separate the financial institutions from the large operating companies, and to limit in the future the expansion of those business groups into more and more businesses when the state allocates new assets, be it in tenders or in privatization. Next slide, please. So this committee was set up in 2010. Later, I will talk about the process with the political economy. The next committee, which was pretty recent, after the success of the concentration committee, we moved to the Strom committee. Dror Strom was the head of the antitrust in Israel 15 years ago, and he headed this committee. And here we decided to separate the banks from the credit card business. The banks in Israel, the two largest banks in Israel, controlled all the credit card business in Israel. They had to divest and sell their credit card businesses, and they sold it to foreign investor, or they floated it in a spin-off to the market. Can you go to the next slide, please? For some reason, I don't see the presentation anymore, but can you please reshare? Okay, can you see the presentation? Okay, fantastic. Okay, now we're going to look very quickly at the effects of those measures, taking the anti-concentration measures. So as you can see here, the sheer size of the business groups in our economy was reduced dramatically. And in important sectors that they controlled, we had increased competition. And some of those companies were replaced, companies that they had to divest, were replaced by new owners, be it private equity, foreign investors, or new entrepreneurs. You can see here the decline in the market share of those large groups and the rise of new players. Next slide, please. Here you can see the growth in the allocation of capital to small businesses, which are now, which has significantly grown, and allocation of capital in Israel is now much more to medium businesses and small businesses on the expense of those highly leveraged holding groups that actually did not bring many times many value to the economy, because they were just, in many ways, some of them were rent seekers because they were monopolies, and other players that were able to generate profits only because they were able to build moats around their businesses using their political power. Now in the next slide, I will give you the best example of how reducing competition creates growth and prosperity for the economy. Next slide, please. So the best example is, of course, the cellular market, the mobile market in Israel. Up until those reforms, we had sort of a cartel of three companies that had the exact same prices and packages for years, and they charge very high prices from dispersed consumers and lower subsidized prices from groups of people that were mostly government employees. Before the reform, the average package in Israel cost anywhere between $80 to $180, which was one of the highest in the OECD. The cartel was owned by those pyramids that I said before, and the biggest company was tied through this pyramid to the largest bank and one of the insurance companies. So once we introduced competition to this market, and later I'll explain how when you bring competition to the financial system, how you bring competition to a real market. Once we had competition there, prices dropped to $15. It was a drop of price between 50% to 90%. So now we are one of the most competitive countries in the world when it comes to cellular prices. Actually, here you can see 2015, prices continue to drop. Please go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Here you can see that they are still dropping. So the average package today with unlimited use of high quality service streaming and so on would cost $15. I have a Chicago package that I roam with of one of the leading providers in the US, and I have an Israeli provider, and the difference between one of them is $15 to $20 per month, and the other one is twice as much or 3 times more expensive. It depends if you're buying a package or separate line. Next slide, please. So what is the political economy of change when you break when you introduce competition? So what happened is that once you deal with separating the financial institutions with the real institution, eliminating those layers in the pyramid and making sure that you focus on concentration, we got a wave of reform in many industries. So we have now increased competition in the supermarket business. We have increased competition in cement with prices dropping, increased competition in asset management, increased competition in cable television prices that drop significantly. And of course, we have 2 other phenomena that of course I cannot show in any convincing way a causality, because those are much more complicated systems with many other parameters. But fact of the matter is that in the last few years in Israel, we have declined in inequality after we had a fast rise for many decades, and we had a fast growth in the real wages of the 2 lowest deciles of the population over the past decades. Next slide, please. Of course, this is an interesting slide. The blue line is the price of consumer goods in OECD countries, including Chile, I assume, and the green line is Israel. And as you can see, Israeli prices went up, of consumer goods went up pretty fast for many years, and then they stabilized in the last 7 years after those reforms. Next slide, please. And of course, venture capital in Israel. Israel was an innovative country, and today is at the peak of its innovation and entrepreneurship stage. Venture capital is booming in Israel. After those reforms, the number of private equity and venture capital firms are increasing all the time. Now we don't have a few players that control asset allocation in Israel. We have numerous numbers of people that are allocating capital in the country, and we have a lot of people coming from all over the world to invest in Israel. Next slide, please. So to sum up before we finish the case study, what happened once you introduce competition, real competition, and you have a real competitive economy, so some of those players cannot compete anymore. So the IDB group that I told you, the chairman had to lose control of that group once it became and then of course, because we had less political capture, the cousin that was the chairman of the bank was found guilty of fraud and went to jail, and the chairman of that group also found guilty of stock manipulation and had to go to jail. And now people feel that there is a competitive, when it comes to competition, it's not only about markets, it's also that the justice system will prosecute everyone if he's involved in stock manipulation or in cartel. So this dramatically increases the confidence of people in the power of markets as something that creates wealth for everyone and not only for small groups of people. Next slide, please. We will talk today about what lessons can be drawn for Chile, if they can be drawn from this case. There are some commentators in the US actually, and we'll probably get to that, that think that also the United States needed those of more competition and less concentration. This is an analysis from the New York Times analyzing how we are able to break the concentration in Israel, the role of very active news media in promoting pro-competition policies in the country. Next slide. So in the last 7 years, most of my work moved to the United States. At the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, that is led by Professor Luigi Zingales, we promote research and discourse on competition. on antitrust and the political economy of regulatory capture. And we also look at media capture and academic capture. Some people frame this resurgence in many places of the importance of competition and to fight anti-concentration as they frame us as new Brandeisian school of thought. And my experience, because of course, Justice Brandeis, that was a key player in the anti-concentration and competition movement in the United States 100 years ago. My experience in Israel is that reducing concentration promotes first and foremost freedom and liberty that in turn promote innovation and entrepreneurship and economic activity and stability. Thank you.
Guy, thank you very much. Brilliant presentation, amazing all that you've done. While you were talking, I was thinking about a quote from Joseph Stiglitz. Once I heard him say, if the banking system, if the banking sector in your country is very profitable, you should be extremely concerned. Minister Briones, we would love to hear your reactions as an overseer to the financial sector. It would be interesting to maybe for Guy to know what's your view on the competitive landscape in Chile, maybe things you're looking at and your vision for the future. Thank you very much.
Great. Should we continue in English or Spanish? I'm a little bit lost.
In English, please. We have a Spanish translator on the side, so we can have both.
First of all, let me thank Guy for his presentation and congratulate him for all he has done in promoting a competition agenda, which has turned in concrete measures in practice in Israel. So it's a great example to follow. Let me start by saying some things. First of all, we, and as an economist, we used to see competition and to evaluate competition based on efficiency arguments, which are, needless to say, very, very important. Because of competition or as a result of competition, we know that consumers can have access to the best products at the lower price. And in tandem with that, the producers are able to produce with the most efficient methods and inputs. So this is for sure very important, but I always used to point out a second and probably more important issue, which is the legitimacy of the markets, the perceived legitimacy of the markets. This is critical, isn't it? Because actually, not always in Chile, but abroad, legitimacy is a critical word, and legitimacy has to do with our markets, which are perceived many times as unfair, as concentrated, as with low levels of competition and so on. So legitimacy is a critical part of this discussion. In my opinion, and I have always argued in this line, competition is a necessary condition for the legitimacy of the markets. And in my opinion, this is the most important issue to have in mind. And this is because of several issues. First of all, if we think deeply, when we talk about competition, basically what we are saying or what we are thinking about is a market that is open to everyone in equal conditions. This is an open access market, which in tandem with that implies that no one has a particular privilege for producing, for having access to the market, for having access to the consumer. So at the end of the day, the basic idea of competition is to go against the idea of privilege. privilege, to have privilege is the contrary of a competition at the end of the day. And this is why I do believe the basic notion of competition is so important for the legitimacy of the market, because basically what you are arguing is that no one is having a special privilege in the market. And this is quite important, not only for efficiency reasons, as I already mentioned, but because of efficiency, of legitimacy, or political economy reasons, in the way that markets should be perceived as an open field, as a competitive field, as a non-arbitrary field, a non-privileged field. And so this is the first point I would like to point out. Let me put it in a different way. We, the people that believe in markets, and this is my case, should defend all the time this basic idea that every player has the same chance to compete, and oppose the idea that some players have some privilege or some marked cards that provide them with a particular privilege to be in the market. So this is my first point. Second point, and this is related with that, and I am pretty sure that Guy agree with this, is that in the public discussion, we market defenders and competition defenders should always put and underline the difference between being pro-market and being pro-business. Many times this distinction is not clear in our countries. People do believe or tend to believe that being pro-business is the same as being pro-market, but of course they are completely different. And this is something that the great Adam Smith dictated more than 200 years ago when he opposed the mercantilists, the pro-business guys that at the same time influenced the parliament and the regulations, and he claimed in favor of competitive market, which is pretty different. The competitive market means to have equal chance of participating for everyone. And so it's a sense of fairness behind the idea of competition, which is quite important. And it's the other side of the coin of this idea of legitimacy. They go in tandem, and this is quite important. So this is my two first point. And then I have a couple of questions for Guy to open out the discussion. Guy, you point a lot of accent in your presentation and what Israel has done in two issues. First, the role of the banks, which of course are quite important as financial intermediaries. And we know that having access to external financing is critical not only for the incumbents, but more important for newcomers, for new companies, for innovation and entrepreneurships. And of course, when you have a non-competitive market in the banking industry and more generally in the financial industry, you are having or extending the non-competitive issue to the market as a whole. So agreeing on that, the question I would like to ask you is, today in 2020 or 21, how important are banks? Because you have other important financial intermediaries that are playing a significant role. I am thinking in the fintech industry and so on. I guess Bill Gates has this sentence saying that banking is necessary, but banks are not. So financing is necessary, but banks, in the typical way we used to see the industry, are not. So this is my first question. How important remains the role of the banks, the banking industry, in terms of promoting competition? Or do you see that we have other ways of accessing to external financing that are able to counteract the original problem you face in your country. And the second question, which is related with the previous one, is the role you assign to the pyramid structures in controlling companies. Because this is something that we also observe in Chile. We have these big conglomerates with pyramidal structure with different and many layers in between. And it's quite interesting to know the Israeli experience in order to address this. And here my question is as follows. One way to avoid having too many layers in a pyramidal structures is simply to forbid the practice, okay? The second one could be to provide incentives to avoid that by means, for example, of, let me say, increase the cost of creating too many layers in a pyramidal structure. For example, putting a tax in order to avoid that. So I would like to hear your view at this regard. So I think with this, I start the conversation and more than glad to continue on that chat. Thank you.
Minister Briones, thank you very much for those comments and these questions. Actually, you nailed it just on the head with your comments and your questions. I will start with your questions. If we have time, I will address one or two of your comments. We'll start with the bank. So I'll start with the bottom line before I describe the process. So the bottom line today is that banks are still important, but today banks, it will be very difficult for them to decide arbitrarily who gets funding and who doesn't get funding. Because today, after the last three reforms, there are many other providers of capital. The non-banking, the other financial intermediaries in Israel has grown significantly, so they can tap markets, the bond market, the equity markets that were 15 years ago controlled by the banks. So what happens is, of course, now you have a dynamic that banks already know that they have to compete. So it definitely changes the entire power dynamics and the competitive dynamics of funding. So banks are still dominant in the Israeli economy, but much less than they were 15 years ago. Now, when the financial system is concentrated, the incentive of banks to see competition in the real market is very low. And and I'll give you a very simple example which illuminates this point and might address exactly your question. 10 years ago, those pyramids controlled the three mobile companies, the largest mobile companies in Israel. And of course, they had a lot of debt on many levels, debt on the level of the company to banks, and debt to the market, to the financial institutions in the holding and companies. So in order to make sure that the debt is sound and there is good chances that they will repay, of course, the banks and the financial institutions didn't want to see competition in the market. The idea that you are lending money to cash cow monopolies, of course, you don't want to see competition. Once we started breaking this and bringing competition to the financial market, separating them, of course, new entrepreneurs could get financing and can penetrate the market. And once we had two players coming into the market, this miracle happened, and the market became more competitive. There is a lot of discussion now in the U.S. on horizontal shareholding. What happens when you have huge asset companies that have stakes, equity stakes in many competing firms? And one view, this is debated in the academia, people are not yet sure, it's not conclusive yet, but people say that when you have asset management companies that control companies that should compete, actually there is an incentive not to compete. Now, if we're let alone, we're talking about banks. Banks that have a lot of lending to companies have much more sway and much more influence on those companies because usually they have covenants. So they have much more relationship with those companies. So today we have a much more vibrant and competitive financial markets, and people can tap to a lot of sources. People can go to private equity, venture capital, to non-banking institutions that were created, and now, of course, and to the asset management that is not controlled by the bank, to the pension funds, the mutual funds, and we have many competing financial resources in the market. Now, for your next questions on the pyramid. First of all, as I showed in the presentation, pyramids create at least 4 problems that economists know how to address, and on top of that, there is the political economy problem of a pyramid that actually you can control 10, 20, 30, or sometimes even more % of the economy, and then if you control 30% of the economy, you control the country, because you would be controlling politicians and the news media and the lobbyists and the accountants and the big law firm and so on. So this is obvious. Now, you had a very good question, and here I'm going to surprise you. So I showed a lot of successes, but of course we had a lot of struggles and challenges in those 15 years, and we made some mistakes. And you really hit on the head with the specific mistakes that we made. So the way we handled the pyramid problem of the layers of the pyramid eventually was that we told those pyramids that we forbid, you cannot have 7 layers, you can only have 2 layers of a pyramid. Some people would argue that the right thing would be 1 layer, and some people would argue that we had some loopholes there with foreign holdings, with the private companies. But actually the real answer, and this is exactly what the Secretary of Finance said, is the best way that we didn't do it, and I think we should have done it, is using incentives. And the best way, I think, is going with taxes. So as you know, a company in Israel, when companies pay dividends, there is an exemption from tax between intercompanies. If we eliminated that tax provision, then we would create an incentive for those companies to get rid of those pyramids. And of course, if you already eliminated those tax, you might think about having tax incentives. And I think that using the tax disincentives or incentives would be a great solution for the question that you have raised. It will be much faster and simpler. And I believe that this was the way actually that was done in the 30s in the United States, because as you know, back until the 1930s in the United States, the U.S. also had pyramids, and they were all dismantled in the 30s, and the way they did it is with taxes. So if I can now address very quickly some of the comments that the minister raised, or I can take other questions. It's your call.
Go ahead, Guy. Maybe you should take those questions, and then we'll give you another extra ones.
Sure. So questions or comments?
No, go ahead with the comments of the minister.
Okay. Comment. So I totally agree with you, Minister, the questions of efficiency, but I think it was Bob Shiller, the Nobel laureate, when I discussed it with him a couple of years ago, he said, efficiency, we must not conflate between dynamic efficiency and static efficiency. Sometimes you can look at the market and it says, this is the number of companies, it means this is the efficient status quo in the market. But actually you would learn that because of market power, there are real barriers to the market. And what we've seen in the Israeli case is that once we started eliminating some of those barriers to the market, we intervene with antitrust tools, with other tools, all of a sudden you see that there is another equilibrium with more players that is more efficient than the equilibrium that we thought before. You mentioned legitimacy of markets. This is the most important thing. This is why the role of academics and the news media in educating the people is so important. We know that those discussions tend to move to a very dichotomic language, capitalism and socialism. And I think we are in 2020, we have enough case studies all over the world to understand that this is not the question anymore. The question is, do we have competitive market, and do we have rules of the game that drive competition and innovation, because they are important for the economy as they are important for the legitimacy. And once we lose the legitimacy, we can go astray in many ways, both on the economic side and on the democratic And last but not least, Minister Briones talked about pro-market versus pro-business. This is exactly the slogan that we use in our informative campaign for years, explaining to people what Adam Smith wrote in 1776, I believe, that that the biggest enemies of capitalism are the capitalists. Capitalists naturally don't like competition. I like competition only when I'm a newcomer to the market. Once I'm entrenched, I don't believe in capitalism. I want to make sure that and the language used by those large entrenched groups is always, they would start to, the way they would push back, and they would try to frame the issue as pro-business or anti-business, which is not the case. The question is, are you pro-market? Are you providing competition? And important, of course, in some markets, you cannot achieve because of market failures, markets that are incomplete, natural monopolies, and so on and so forth. If you can show me really that you cannot bring or asymmetric information in some markets, or some markets like healthcare system, where we know that competition doesn't drive efficiency many times, in those markets, you need regulation, or you need some kind of intervention. But most of the markets that we deal with, when we talk about business groups, competition will do the work.
Go ahead, Nico. Maybe we hear you without the image.
Sure. Hello?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, fascinating topic. Guy, yesterday you were telling me a little bit about your conversation with Foreign Minister Netanyahu. I believe you haven't disclosed that publicly, but I'm intrigued because you were willing to disclose it today. I wonder, today there's only 1 year left in this government. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how this anti-concentration law was passed? Do you think there's time enough for a minister of finance or for a president that they only have 12 months to go?
Okay, thank you, Nico. So as an editor-in-chief of the leading financial newspaper in the country at this particular time, of course, I had many discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he was Prime Minister and when he was Finance Minister. But you are particularly alluding to a very specific conversation that would shed some light on the situation now in Chile. So in 2000, we set up the committee of the anti-concentration in 2010. The problem was that there was huge pushback from all the entrenched monopolists and business groups. They didn't want to see competition in the market, and they said everything is okay. And the committee actually went nowhere. But then in the summer of 2011, we had a huge social protest in Israel. I believe that 20 to 30 people of the adults in Israel were out on the street. Now, this was a very interesting social protest in Israel because it was focused not on the usual right and left issues. It was a social protest that was only on economic issues and the cost of living and crony capitalism, okay? And so Netanyahu, at some point, there were hundreds of thousands. You know, Israel is a small country with 9 million people. And at some point, Netanyahu thought that they are going to overthrow him because the protest was so huge. So at one point, just before one of the biggest demonstrations, he asked to meet me and to talk about what's happening and what should be done, what kind of policies should be implemented. And then he raised the issue with the anti-concentration committee. And I told him, Netanyahu, this committee is going nowhere. Half of the people on this committee are the regulators, the people in antitrust, in the Securities and Exchange Commission. Half of the people here are already left the committee, and they are going to work for those pyramids. And the rest are thinking about whether in the future they will work in those companies. And this committee is not going anywhere. So this is an opportunity. Now you have tailwind from the people that want to see change. Why want to bring a pro-market and break the concentration in the economy? And so I left his office very late at night in Jerusalem, and I didn't know what's going to happen. And the day after, when I woke up, I opened the radio and I hear that Netanyahu in the morning summoned the members of the concentration committee, and he told them, I want to see real results right now. 2 months after that came the interim report of the concentration committee, and all of a sudden the tone has changed. Houston, we have a problem. Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, we have a problem. Okay, we have concentration and we have to move forward. A year after that came the last version of that the report with breaking up the pyramid, separating financial, all the recommendations that we were pushing very aggressively for a while. And then something amazing happened. At the end of 2013, the bill was approved in the Israeli parliament. But listen to that. What happened in the approval was that it was approved by all parties in the House, people that never agree on anything. The people on the extreme right, the people on the right, the people on the center parties, political parties, the people on the left and the extreme left. They all came together. Think about it. An economic reform, the people on the right and people on the left are all coming together because we're able to change the narrative and tell people this is not a question whether you are right-wing or left-wing. This is how you promote a more efficient, a more competitive, and a more just society. So it was approved by all, yes.
I would like, you're now telling us how a political decision got finally to become a law and to become a practice in your country. But we're struggling here with an economic crisis. So basically all public policies are based on economic relief or activation of the economy. How did you manage and what key messages did you provide between the political decision of Netanyahu and finally the law that made the competition become a topic for all society? And then I would like to take the same question to the minister. If Minister Briones sees a space right now to go ahead with the agenda.
Okay, so I'll start with the latter question that you had. How did we become on the agenda? So as you know, we had the privilege and I had two privileges. First of all, I founded the Marker newspaper and I was the editor-in-chief for 13 years. And it was part of a group, Haaretz group, which is the only news media group that is not part of this ecosystem of conglomerates that have monopolies and so on. What we do is journalism. And the chairman and the owner of that company, Mr. Shoken, gave me total backing throughout this process, even when we had huge pushback from all the various players, because he comes from families that believe that journalism is all about the readers and the good of the society, and not being on the good books of advertisers or banks. So we were able really to influence the public discourse in the country. At some point, I have to say it cost us a lot of money because they were very vindictive with us, those business groups. But eventually, we prevailed, and today we are strong and independent because you can have strong and independent news media when you have a diversified economy and not a concentrated economy that the news outlets have to cater to the concentrated power. So we influence the public discourse. Now, as for your questions of this crisis, so I come from the school that believes that a crisis is an opportunity. I'm not familiar with what's happening currently in Chile, but in a crisis you can do a lot of things that usually that you can push reforms much faster if you are determined that you want to do those reforms. First of all, if you are in a crisis, some of those players, the entrenched players that actually don't want to see competition, they need the help of the government in those situations sometimes. And then you start negotiate. You want me to help you? Fine, I will help you right now because of the COVID-19, but you will have to play with me and have more competition in the market. So you can use actually the crisis as a lever to have that once you will get out of that crisis, we'll have a more competitive and just economy.
I would like to take the question to the minister. Do you think there's space right now to put in public agenda a reform towards competition in different fields?
Absolutely. I fully agree with E in terms of that the crisis is an opportunity. And I agree with him, with his suggestion that in economic terms, you should see a move towards competition, not only in the short-term impact that probably you will deal with vested interest and opposition and so on, but in its medium and long-term benefits. And we know that competition means innovation, means opportunity, means legitimacy, and means productivity. So at the end of the day, if we are worried about our medium and long-term economic prospects, I am convinced that everything you can do in moving towards more competition is part of the answer. Yeah, probably the most important part of the answer. And secondly, I think, and let me come back with a comment I proposed to Guy. Let me come back to this idea of legitimacy, because the other way to talk about legitimacy is the concept of abuse. And the idea of abuse, if we think deeply, at least in economic in terms, the idea of abuse is only possible in a non-competitive market. In a very competitive market, this feeling of abuse from the consumers, in principle, is not possible, because the providers, the suppliers, the companies are all the time trying to do their best to provide the best product at the lower price, the most innovative product at the lower price. And this is dynamic, it's changing every day. While when you have this perception of abuse, it's more than probable that is because you have a lack of competition behind, allowing somebody, some company, some industry to abuse in some sense from the consumer. So probably the question I would like to ask to Guy there is that if this perception that theoretically is correct, do you see that in practice in your country is an idea that is shared by the population, that this relationship between an abstract concept, which could be competition, is able to be realized in a very practical and day-to-day concept, which is the perception of abuse by people? So this is a question. So Marily, absolutely. I think we should move towards this agenda of more competition, which means less concentration, a division of the economic power. At the end of the day, this is what a competitive market means, and we should move forward to that. And in that way, let me say that, because probably Guy does not know all the details, but we have experienced significant advance, I would say, in Chile. First of all, in our antitrust law, which has been amended significantly in the good direction. Secondly, and you was referring to competition in the mobile phone industry. In Chile, we passed several years ago a portability law, allowing people to switch from company by means of keeping their phone number, which is a critical transaction cost, let's say, for people in order to move. And as you mentioned, the price has declined dramatically. and you have more providers, more competition, more innovation. So once again, this is a proof that competition works. And in tandem with that, and coming back to the financial industry, we recently passed a law called financial portability, which relies on the same idea, basically lowering the transaction cost every customer face when trying to change their financial products from one institution to the other. This law will become to be implemented in September. And we really expect to have a significant move and significant debt consolidation from people that is, in a sense, captured by its financial institution, paying high interest rates, that because of this law and because of the competition that is behind, will be able to consolidate this debt and show this debt to some other financial suppliers that are able to propose them significant lower interest rates. So this is, once again, a proof that competition is good for customers and good for the perception of legitimacy. But then let me ask you a second question, Guy, and I would really like to hear your view on this. I think the second move we should pursue here after this financial portability is to move towards open banking, which is basically a second step and more significant step, which at the same time is based on data portability. At the end of the day, in the 21st century, probably the more interesting issues about promoting competition has to do with the ownership of our data and the capacity to move this data all around the different industry. And so I would like to hear your view on these two issues. First is, in your experience, how the abstract idea of competition is able to move to the real world, to the citizenship perception by means of a more political term, which is abuse. And the second question is your perception about open banking and data portability as a necessary condition for fostering competition.
Mr. Briones, thank you very much for those two questions. So we'll start with the narrative of abuse and the competition. So when we were in the middle of the fight with to promoting those competition, much of the language at this point, of course, was the language of abuse of power, and there were many incidents, many events that actually showed it, how people were abusing their power in the financial system, how the people used it in large public companies, and there was also some illegality and crime and white collar crimes involved. There was the question of revolving doors of regulators and politicians. But at the end of the day, so this was many ways the way that politicians can engage with those issues. But when I look at the last 10 years, I think that what has changed in many ways is the way a lot of the public addresses those issues. And the language of competition today is present in much of the discussion, be it in the news media, be it in the parliament, or so what we're able to do, and it's somehow different in that what you have in, I don't know, the US today, for instance, or other countries, is that you would hear a discourse on economic policies, and you won't be hearing people screaming, this is ruthless capitalism, or this is socialism. No, people don't speak this language. People today many times would use the language of competition. And one of the biggest achievements here is to have many people out there in the broader public talking about those issues and framing it in a way that economists would phrase it, and not in the way that populist politicians and rabble rouser would use. Now let's talk about the digital. So if I knew that we're also discussing this question, I would prepare a presentation. But actually, we are now in the middle of reform in the Strom Committee. The last reform, we're in the middle of reform that exactly deals with the portability of data. And actually, what's going to happen? So what we're doing now is forcing all the banks in Israel to have open APIs. Okay, and we are creating an infrastructure that any new fintech company can plug into this new infrastructure and automatically have a clearing system where you can first of all get all the data, and which is key because I learned from past mistakes that within 20 years that if you don't have those APIs and you let the banks withhold their data, actually it kills the new people who want to go into the market. And actually what's going to happen right now is very interesting, both on the tech side and on the political side. So for the first time in the history of the country, we are next year, there is going to be launched a new digital-only bank. And the interesting thing about this bank, so people have been talking about digital banks in Israel for the past more than a decade, but actually never went through. Why? Two reasons. Number one, Bank of Israel and the Ministry of Finance did not put in place this open access to data and to the newcomer, and people understood that it's not going to happen, and they will invest a lot of money and they will fail. That's number one. Number two is people didn't want to compete with the banks because the banks had power everywhere. Now, because we reduced the competition, because we inserted into the narrative the role of competition, now actually Bank of Israel is now pursuing very vigorously the idea that you should have open APIs in order to encourage new players into the market. That's number one. And number two, we have one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country saying, Bank of Israel still demands a lot of equity because he wants to make sure that the bank won't fail. So although you need to put a lot of equity into the new bank, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country says, I will put all the equity required. I will tell you something about this entrepreneur, and I will risk it because I believe today that regulators really want to see competition here. You have to look in the eye to the Bank of Israel governor, to the central bank governor, and to the Ministry of Finance, and to the antitrust authority, and believe them that they want competition and they won't tolerate any anti-competitive behavior by the entrenched banks. So the person who is going to do it actually is a high-tech entrepreneur. This is the guy that founded a company called Mobileye that deals with autonomous cars, and it was sold 3 years ago to Intel for $50 billion. So he has the resources, he's very smart, and he's going to invest a lot of his money. And now we are seeing, as we talk today, we're seeing a lot of effort by some groups that are promoting competition in the financial system, making sure that we have portability in the banking system, open APIs and open access, which is key, and it's a huge opportunity, of course.
Guy, so the open banking, I mean, this is fascinating, Minister, and it's great to hear all the things that are happening and will happen soon. My question, Guy, now I'm going to bring in my entrepreneurial bias here, but again, this government has one year to go. There's so many things have happened in Israel. If the president was listening to you, and maybe he is actually, what would be your 3 to 6 month plan? Where should he focus? How do you get all this anti-concentration and competitive dynamism? How do you get it going?
First of all, you have to face the facts. You have to know the facts. Okay, you have to look at the market. I think in the case, I think today there is enough literature and enough studies and case studies. First of all, to look at the market and ask yourself, are we a concentrated market or not? You start looking at the vertical market. and then you can look at the entire market. So number one, first of all, let's look in the mirror and see whether we are a competitive economy or whether we're just selling ourselves and the world that we're a competitive economy, because the benchmark that we have might be the wrong benchmark. You know, Chile is amazing success, but maybe one of the reasons that it's such a success because you chose the wrong benchmark, because there are other countries around you that are not doing very well. So perhaps you should choose yourself different benchmarks of very competitive countries and how do their markets look like. Now, so the first of all is to know the effect. Number two, as I said, I think that I'm not privy to what's happening now, the challenges specifically in Chile, but I guess that if you have a lot of negotiation now with big companies because you need to help the business sector, you should put on the agenda that from now on we don't do anything before we make sure that the market is competitive, that we remove barriers to entry, and we remove regulation that actually is put some of those regulations. You know, there are two kinds of regulations. One that are meant to really protect the consumers and the environment and the taxpayers and so on, asymmetric information and so on. And there are a lot of regulations that are put in place just to make sure that there is no competition. So number two is to look at those issues. And again, I believe it's high time. One of the reasons you have a fantastic opportunity today is not only because of the crisis, because it is also something happening in the US. In the US, as you know, because of the big tech companies, there is a resurgence of discussion on the role of competition. If you go to the US news media in the last 4 years, you will see a surge in discussion and discourse that the United States doesn't have enough competition and there is too much concentration. We've been helping drive that at Booth Business School, at the Stigler Center. We've been promoting this discussion and helping this discussion and pushing for a lot of other academics to deal with it. And there is growing literature on our issues. So if the situation, up until 5 years ago, there was a notion as if antitrust is not relevant anymore, markets are great, left to their own devices, we're doing fine. Most people don't think that this is the case anymore. You hear from right and the left, from Republicans and Democrats, called for to see more competition. You've probably seen the last hearing that we had 3 weeks ago, in the Senate with Senator Cicilline, the head of the committee, and you saw how smart congressmen and congresswomen on the right and on the left are asking very good questions about competition, dynamic competition, dynamic efficiencies, questions of very sophisticated questions on concentration and competition have come up in those discussions. Again, this is something that you have like a wind at your back when you're trying now to address those issues in Chile.
Thank you very much, Guy. We are sort of running out of time. We have more than 1,000 people listening to us, but I would like to ask Nico and Ministro Briones to give me just a second to ask you about journalism. You teach this spring at Chicago Booth what seems a very interesting course called Reputation, Regulation, and Communications, How Media Influence Business. I would very briefly to talk to us about the access of this reflection and how it becomes more important today.
Well, you know, when it comes to, everybody knows that when it comes to business strategy, you know, when you can go through a business school, your MBA, and not hear the word government even once. You know, in most of the time, in many MBAs, we just think that, you know, we just talk about markets, you know, consumer markets, investor markets, talent market, and so on. Now, when you go up the corporate ladder, you understand that in business, there is the rules of the game, the laws and the regulation are very important. So if you really if you want to come to devise a strategy for your company, be it a large company or even a small company, I also teach a class on entrepreneurship and working with venture capital and with small companies, be it small companies or large companies, you have to understand politics and regulation. Now, once you understand that business has to also look at the non-market factors, you have to ask yourself, okay, what are the incentives that influence politicians and regulators? And of course, the answer is that the news media plays a big role here, because the news media is the main intermission channel between companies and their stakeholders and companies and politicians. So the news media is out there all the time influencing your strategy vis-a-vis all your stakeholders, and particularly influencing your relationship with politicians and regulators. So we give our students at both the tools to understand non-market forces, okay, the forces of government, of other players that influence the business in which the company is embedded in, and we give them tools to understand how the news media works and the role of news media in shaping the reputation of companies, shaping the reputation of regulators and politicians, and how media can play, how media is sometimes captured, how media influences this game. And of course, in the last 80 minutes that we discussed, you saw that news media always had a big part in the political economy story that I described here. And let me tell you, since in the last 5 years, we're looking at all countries and around the world, everywhere you go, the deeper you go, you understand that markets has to do with whether you have competitive markets or less competitive markets, the relationship with business and with the government. There is always the news media there, sometimes in a very, conspicuous way. Sometimes you can see it, sometimes it's for stealth mode, but the news media plays a huge role in the political economy of most countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Guy. I would like to give Minister closing remarks, if you'd like.
No, just to thank Marily, Nico, and especially Guy for this opportunity. I think this is one of the most important topics we can have in mind. I insist, I think that we, the people who believe in competitive and open markets, this is one of the most important challenges, not only because of efficiency gains or efficiency reasons, which are real and are true, but I insist because of legitimacy, because we are living in a context, several countries and Chile as well, of a perception of illegitimacy of several institutions, and the market is one, probably the most important institution, and we should defend its legitimacy, and the way to defend it is through the defense of competition, competitive markets, and an anti-abuse agenda, which is closely related, of course, with the pursuit of competitive markets. So thank you for this opportunity. I wish we will have the time to speak again, probably in private, and please send my best regards to Luigi Singales, a good friend, and he has been here in Chile some months ago. And thank you, Guy.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Nico, you will say goodbye? And then we're closing this for...
Guy, Minister, Marily, thank you so much. Thank you to all the team of the Diario Financiero who made this happen. And Mr. Minister, just remember that behind the G100, we're thousands of entrepreneurs that will always be on the right side of the force to promote a more competitive landscape, to make Chile the country we know that can. So thank you very much.
With this Star Wars reflection of Nicolás, we'll close this summit. And for us who joined us late, we'll have the video of this streaming as soon as possible on Diario Financiero. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Un discurso político que remueve los mercados es señal de poder. Una pandemia mundial es señal de lo frágiles que somos. El destacado manejo de la crisis en Alemania es señal de un buen liderazgo. El cambio climático y la sequía son señal de que tenemos mucho por hacer. La colaboración entre pequeñas empresas es señal de un país que está cambiando. Las señales hay que leerlas. Sigue la dirección correcta del mundo y tus negocios. DF Full Digital, contenidos especializados y más. Diario Financiero. Las señales hay que leerlas.